There we go. Sorry about that. Had to just transition over a little bit. So we're going to talk here about South Korean animation real quick. Well, for the next little while, um, because I want to talk a little bit about South Korean animation, something that I particularly love. And to begin with, let's actually just kind of nail down exactly what we're talking about here. Um, uh, so first off, the reason I'm doing this panel is because I think for a lot of people, when they think of animation, they just kind of think, okay, Walt Disney, the end, or you know, anime, the end, and the reality is that there's animation being made all over the world for in many different ways, many different places, and I want to kind of shine a spotlight on animation that's being made in lots of places, particularly South Korea, because it's a really interesting history. Whoops, sorry, 1 second. Had to pull something up, which bounced all over the place. Um, so yeah, wow, things are going all over the place here. Um, so first off, we need to establish kind of what I'm talking about in terms of animation and kind of because I want to focus in a little bit. I'm not going to be talking in this panel about South Korean animation that is CGI, that is puppetry, or that's stop motion. I think all of those are absolutely animation. Maybe puppetry you could question, but I'm kind of trying to limit the scope of the panel to hand drawn animation in this case. There's some lovely CGI stuff out there, lovely stop motion stuff, but again, there's just kind of only so much I can dig into. Also, I'm not going to be talking about commercial animation, as animation made as advertisements, which is kind of unfortunate because when you think globally, there has probably been more animation produced for advertising than there has been for like movies. I think about all the animated ads out there. There's been tremendous amounts of hand-drawn animation made in the commercial space, and who drew that? We have no idea. Who made all that stuff? We have no idea. So unfortunately, there's just not much we can talk about there, which is again just kind of unfortunate, but just that is the case. Um, Also, I'm not going to be talking about short films, experimental films, that kind of stuff. It's a very interesting area, but I'm going to be focusing more on like commercial releases of animation. Again, lots of cool, short films being made by independent animators and so forth, but just kind of out of scope. Okay, so let's talk about Korea and some of this and the history of animation in Korea. It's perhaps a little controversial to say, but the thing about South Korea in terms of animation is that really there was not a lot of infrastructure to produce hand-drawn animation in South Korea in the early 20th century as there was in other countries. There just wasn't enough money flowing around, not enough film being produced to really support an animation industry, really until the 1960s. There are some exceptions. There was a black and white commercial for Lucky Toothpaste in 1956, made by Moon Dalbu. Also, I'm going to be mispronouncing names like crazy here. I apologize. And why is that? Well, you may have heard of the Korean War. That may have been mentioned at some point in the 1950s. That certainly complicated things. That's what created North and South Korea. And by the way, there is animation produced in North Korea. You can look it up. Surprise, surprise! It's all hardline communist propaganda, but that certainly exists and is a thing if you want to dig into that. However, the 1960s did see a promising start to South Korean animation. There was a short based on The Ant and the Grasshopper in 1961, which showed that there was a space for this. And the animator of that, in 1967, released a full-color animated film, Gildong, or The Adventure of Gildong, in 1967. Why that's impressive is you have to remember that Astro Boy had only been released 4 years prior. Anime was in its infancy over in Japan, and there was already a feature-length animated film in South Korea. There had been a couple of feature-length animated films in Japan, but very few and far between. But now we had Hong Gildong in South Korea, and the animation honestly rivaled what you saw in Japan at the time. If you've seen Panda and the Magic Serpent from around this area, it's very similar in art style. Obviously, the production process was not quite as smooth as it was in other countries, but this is a thoroughly entertaining, mythological adventure tale in the classic sense of like Journey to the West and a lot of those other classic stories. And we had the Greek myth panel just a little bit ago, and very much in that style, like a Greek Ulysses style myth, but about a famous Korean character. And that's really, really impressive. And that spawned quite a few animated feature films during the late 60s, particularly adaptations of traditional stories and Korean comics of the time. However, this is the 1960s, time marches on, and there is this thing called the television. And TV was a really big deal. TVs were starting to really come into every household in Japan. And as a result, interest in movies in general decreased. So folks weren't going out to the movies as much, they were going to watching television, which is a thing that happened kind of globally as television took off. Film viewership tanked, more or less, or definitely decreased. So folks were going to television. And unfortunately for the Korean animation industry in general, there was this thing called anime, where suddenly anime showed up as an import possibility. And anime, as well as American animation, were all imported in Japan. And the problem was, it was massively cheaper to license an anime series than it was to create a whole animation from scratch. And there was so much, by the early to late 70s, there was so much anime and American animation to license that why not just license? And this led to a dramatic decline in the South Korean animation industry. When Mazinger Z was released in Korea in 1975, after its release in 1972 in Japan, things were so bad that there had been no new Korean animations produced in the country for the previous 3 years. So from 72 to 75, there were no new Korean animations. There was just no work. Now, obviously, there was probably commercial work being done. They were doing ads and things like that. But in terms of like commercial animation production, it just disappeared in the early 70s because it was just so much cheaper to import from other countries. There was just no demand for it. So the Korean animators basically decided, well, if you can't beat them, join them. So shortly thereafter came the premiere of a Korean animated series called Robot Taekwon V, a Taekwondo fighting giant robot that looks kind of similar. Yeah, little bit. Just saying. And so this led to a number of giant robot movies and some TV shows, but mostly movies that copied popular anime. And when I say copied, I mean, copied. Now, Robot Taekwon V is kind of interesting because the creator said, like, he was deliberately doing an homage to Mazinger Z. He didn't see this as like ripping it off. He meant as saying, hey, that's cool. I want to make my own version of that. So he just saw it as, again, strong artistic inspiration as opposed to other things. But it was not necessarily seen the same way by other people, as you might imagine. then other productions sprang up, and boy, they copied. I mean, not like this. I mean, they would literally send people to Japan to walk into animation companies and just take like character designs off of desks and like photocopy them and take them home. Like that kind of a level thing. They would literally just copy character and mecha designs and maybe change the color scheme. And when I say that, I mean pretty literally, yeah, like that's just Char Aznable with a different color scheme from Space Black Knight in 1979. And for those of you Gundam fans out there, you will know what's kind of remarkable about this is that Gundam came out in 1979. So they were like current with what was coming out in Japan. They were just grabbing that stuff and taking it over to Korea. It wasn't like, oh, this is something that we saw on television. No, they were pulling stuff from the production offices. Pretty crazy. There was a lot of that stuff going on in South Korea at the time. And oddly, despite the success of these works, Korean animation quality didn't really improve during this time. Animation basically just stayed very crude, very simple, very much like kind of the 60s. If you look at Korean animation all throughout this period, it all looks pretty much the same. You don't see that dramatic improvement in animation quality that you start seeing in anime in similar times. And then, unfortunately, in 1979, South Korean General President Park Chung-hee was assassinated, which led to wide protests and a new military dictatorship that continued until 1987. This was a very turbulent period in South Korean history, and during this period, a flood of anime entered the market, and that suppressed demand for native Korean work, and it just kind of just even further suppressed the market. There were some animated SF films made in this period. Space Legend Terra in 1982, Video Ranger 007, and others. But the 1980s also saw the return to South Korea of Nelson Shin. Nelson Shin had gone to America to work with Marvel Productions. And he came back to South Korea to form an animation studio in South Korea, specifically to work on international productions. Basically, he saw so much animation being produced internationally, he said, I can set up an animation studio in South Korea that can produce animation inexpensively for American clients, international clients, so forth and so on. And so he produced ACOM Productions. Or ACOM Production. He directed Transformers the movie in 1986, to give you an idea, and then worked on everything from G.I. Joe to the Pink Panther, Tiny Toon Adventures. He done all of that actually before ACOM Productions, just to be clear. At ACOM, they worked on The Simpsons, Land Before Time, Batman the Animated Series, and even anime. They were doing so for international for generally for American releases. They would do the animation. They would animate an episode of Batman, for example, or they would animate complete shots for a show. For anime, they would generally do what's called tweening. So a Korean a Japanese artist would do the main drawings in a sequence. And then those would get sent over to Korea, where Korean artists would draw all the drawings in between. So if you had 8 drawings in an action sequence to get something across, the key animator in Japan might draw 3 of those. And then the South Korean animator would draw the 5 in between that are kind of easier to do. And so you saw that with ACOM Production, and they produced a lot of stuff. They got really, really impressive, to the point where ACOM Production worked on Princess Mononoke. Yeah, they did shots for a Hayao Miyazaki movie later on. So this was a shot in the arm to the South Korean animation industry. It was still doing primarily work internationally, but there was now money flowing in, and there was now, more importantly, skilled individuals in South Korea producing animation. So the talent pool was there now. Then, in 1987, a democratic government took power and quickly began encouraging local cultural production, including animation. And so they were really pushing for domestic production of domestic artistic works. And then the two main TV stations in Korea, KBS and MBC, began financing animated TV series. Again, sort of a cultural thing. And that helped a lot, particularly Theodore Kakashi, which was a baseball anime from '87, was a hit, as was Dooley the Little Dinosaur, which, as you can see, is a kids show, but spawned a major franchise and now it's still to this day generates $1 million a year in revenue, which is pretty cool. And so you started seeing domestic animation production. The big ones at the time were like usually Taekwondo series, big shock, and science fiction series. Again, it was the 80s. That was a big thing back then. But unfortunately, well, not unfortunately, but the reality was you really started seeing the animation industry focus on children. And really there was this split. So you had in television, basically kids productions. Pororo, the Little Penguin, was a huge smash CGI success in 2003, which I mentioned here because it was the Korean animation industry's first international hit. The economic impact is now into the billions of dollars. Like, it's a huge thing, particularly in East Asia. But you didn't really see a lot of more serious adult-oriented stuff on television. You saw people trying to do that in movies, and you saw a bunch of different really interesting movies made during the 90s in Japan. My Beautiful Girl Marie, Wonderful Days, Oceam, Yogi the Five-Tailed Fox. All of these movies are interesting, more teenager or adult-driven movies. Yogi the Five-Tailed Fox is basically a Miyazaki movie concept. Wonderful Days is this sort of cyberpunky thing. Really cool. Oceam is sort of a Grave of the Fireflies-esque, sort of serious, very serious movie. And they would come out, and they'd be really interesting, and no one would go to see them in the theaters. They were just all box office bombs. The South Korean industry just could not get a film industry going, nor interest in more serious animated works. Until 2011, when two animated films came out. The first is called Leafy, A Hen into the Wild. And this is a broadly family film about a hen who lives on a farm and wants to leave the farm and live in the wild, and manages to do so, and the things that happen to her. It is, on the one hand, again, clearly aimed at kids because it's, farmyard animals and other like birds in the area that she gets to know, and she wants to be a mother, but she can't, basically. But then she adopts, and things develop. That said, this is a movie about industrial level farming and what happens to chickens in that kind of environment, as well as what happens to chickens out in the world where they are a prey species. So there's definitely drama to this film, definitely melodrama if nothing else. And there's some stuff that happens in this movie. And it was very successful. Lots of folks came to see the movie. And so it kind of bridged that gap between clearly kind of having an art style. And it's beautiful much of the time. Really lovely film. And so you can go and see that, but also there was an edge to the film. And speaking of edge, The same year saw the release of The King of Pigs. This is a very much a movie aimed at adults. It opens with a man with no clothes on in an apartment having just killed his wife. It's one of those movies. It's about bullying in school. It's about all sorts of very, very heavy topics. And low budget indie film, but it still brought in a large audience and nearly made back its entire budget in box office receipts alone. Suddenly now folks were tuning in to watch, or not tuning in, going to theaters to watch South Korean animation. And this led to a kind of a renaissance in the intervening years. Now we're seeing more and more interesting South Korean animated films. Lower right is from Fake, by the same creator as the same director as King of Pigs, which is obviously zombie survival horror. I'm sorry, Fake is upper left. Bottom right is Soul Station. That's so. Yeah. Can you see my mouse cursor? Yes, you can. So this is Soul Station. That's Fake, which is more like a crime film, as you might imagine. Down here is, that is Satellite Girl and Milk Cow, which has some really weird things, but is more of like a teen romantic comedy thing with some sci-fi elements. And then Clockwork Girl in 2014, CGI, but you can see the skill level really coming together. And that's been doing really well. And meanwhile, we've seen some animated hits on Korean television. Larva CGI series, which made $9 million in 2013, and even had, you know how in Japan they'll have like anime characters on like buses and train cars. Larva characters were featured on like subway cars in South Korea. It got that big. So the animation industry has definitely gotten moving in South Korea, which was really, really cool. It looked dark there for a while because they just couldn't get things moving. But there's a lot of interesting stuff in South Korean animation. If you're interested in it, highly recommend tracking down some of these films. It's now to the point where there's probably something for something for everyone. There's, science fiction or romance or action or drama or what have you. So there's a lot of cool stuff out there. I will say it's hard to find a lot of this stuff because a lot of it just hasn't been released over here in America. Leafy actually did get a Canadian release, so you can find that over there. And so, yeah, there are definitely a few options. Yogi the Five-Tailed Fox was on Netflix for a while. I'm not sure if it's still there. And so you can find bits and pieces, but you do have to search. And I personally believe that the search is worth the wait. So, that is a brief history of South Korean animation. I'm looking in the chat. Anyone have any questions for me about that? Be happy to answer any questions anyone has. Manav, you're absolutely right. Manhwa has been on the upswing for a very long time, and it's been a really big deal. Yeah, unfortunately, South Korean animation is not like anime. There's been so relatively little of it that it's hard to say, oh, well, here are the top 10 greatest South Korean animated works, because that's going to be a significant fraction of all South Korean animated movies, right, or whatever. So I didn't end this with like, here's what you should totally watch, but definitely worth checking out stuff out there, and I think people should just be aware of that. I personally believe that South Korean animation is going to is poised to hit the international scene in a big way. That we could be talking about South Korean animation the same way we talk about Japanese animation, and there have been several completely South Korean animated TV series that like aired in Japan that look just like anime. It's just right there. it's definitely been a big thing. Um, but yeah, there are lots and lots of options. Mm, potential. What do I think changed culturally that made anime more accepted in South Korea, going into theaters, actually making money? I think honestly, it was a matter of build up over time. I think because the animators didn't give up, because they kept producing animated films, and it wasn't the same animators for every single film. Obviously, it was this person would do this person over there would do this, etc. and so forth, and maybe this person would then come back 5 years later and produce something. And I think that just built, and it built to the point where people were just used to there being animated films. So that when something like, Leafy or King of Pigs came out, it became, if not normal, then an understandable thing to do, right? I think it was one of those things where you needed to make it normal, if you will, just be out there. Yeah, I agree, James. It would be nice to see more South Korean work sort of break through the way Chinese animation is starting to get visible. I am digging into Chinese animation, but that takes some research and effort. That is not immediately obvious what's out there. Yeah, Golden Bat was definitely a thing. So yeah. Yeah, if you know some South, so if you can invest in ACOM Productions, this is one of the problems. Unfortunately, so many of them are. I mean, they're all South Korean companies, so they generally are not available for international investment. Sadly. Yeah, I agree, Ginger. Often manhwa ends up getting animated in Japan because Japan has a production capacity, right? And that's not insane. It's a matter of other countries that just have a much larger industry, and so it kind of makes sense to go over there because it's like, well, here's a studio that's laying around looking for work. Might as well go there than trying to find one of the very few companies in Japan producing this. And it's also difficult because there's a big difference between tweening and doing that sort of interstitial work and doing that kind of, we're coming in to help out with animation, as opposed to doing a production from scratch. The skills are not the same. So even though you may have an animation industry that's producing, all of these cuts, all of these drawings, all of the other pre-production work, they may not be skilled in, and so it takes a while to get those skills going. A Korean series I'd like to see a Korean anime of, Ragnarok. I really enjoyed that manhwa back in the day, which is this giant, and there may be one. I honestly have not checked recently. But that is an older, long form Korean action thing that I just love to see done in Korean animation. I'd love to see what other folks in the chat think about that actually, because I'm not as deep into South Korean, into manhwa as other folks. I just haven't read as much manhwa as other things. Shaman Warrior, cool. Yeah. Actually, no. I take that back. There's another one I want to see. 1 second. What? I just bought this recently. And I can't remember its name. There we go. Is that? Yeah, it's fine. Mythology of the Heavens. This is a really popular manhwa that is considered one of the great epic stories of manhwa. One of these are just really big stories of, epic things happening. And I've got to be careful here because it often shows stories of people living out in the wild who do not have the same modesty standards that we have. This looks okay, but to give you an idea of the general just sort of artistic quality here, it's really impressive. And definitely one of those big stories, big dramas. Oh, there's a Ragnarok movie that came out. Awesome. There we go. Oh, maybe Ragnarok on Netflix. Yeah, awesome. So yeah, Mythology of the Heavens, really interesting. But again, be aware, nudity, quite a bit of nudity and violence. It's one of those. But I think it is all nudity and violence that are in service of the story and the thing being done. Cool. We're gonna take a quick break. We'll be back in about 10 minutes with Unagi Observer's History and Anime panel. I will see you all then.